The studio lights beamed down relentlessly on Mark Winters as he settled into his familiar chair on the set of Tonight with Mark, the late-night talk show that had made him a household name across America. The glossy desk before him reflected the carefully designed lighting, creating an atmosphere of casual importance that had become his trademark over 15 years in the business. "We're back in 30 seconds, called the floor director, prompting Mark to straighten his tie and glance at his notes. Tonight's panel discussion about comedy in the modern era had been going smoothly, until it wasn't. "So what about someone like Adam Sandler?" asked Vanessa Moore, the culture critic sitting across from him. His comedy has evolved significantly over the decades. Something in Mark shifted. Perhaps it was fatigue from the grueling press tour for his new book, or the lingering resentment from being passed over for the Sandler interview that went to his network rival instead. Whatever the catalyst, the filter between his private thoughts and public persona momentarily dissolved. "Evolved? That's generous," Mark said with a dismissive wave. "Let's be honest, Sandler's just recycling the same childish jokes he's been peddling since the 90s. The industry keeps rewarding mediocrity because he's got the right connections. His last 3 films were embarrassingly bad, but nobody has the courage to say it." The studio fell silent. His co-host, Diane, visibly stiffened beside him. In the control room, the executive producer's face paled. Mark continued, unaware of the shifting atmosphere. "I mean, the guy makes millions for essentially playing the same character with different names. It's not talent. It's Hollywood nepotism at its finest." Only when the segment ended did his producer, James Chen, approach with a tight expression. "We need to talk, Mark. Now." The green room felt suddenly claustrophobic as James closed the door behind them. "What the hell was that?" "What? I just gave my honest opinion," Mark defended, loosening his tie. "Your honest opinion just insulted one of the most beloved figures in entertainment, who happens to be friends with half our advertisers and is starring in our parent company's biggest summer release." Reality began to dawn on Mark. "Come on, it wasn't that bad." James held up his phone, showing Twitter already ablaze with clips of the segment. "It's already trending. Winters Fired is picking up steam." By morning, the controversy had exploded. Clips of his comments circulated across every platform, stripped of context and magnified by social media's outrage machine. The network's phones rang incessantly. Advertisers began threatening to pull their spots. 3 days later, Mark sat across from Elaine Hoffman, the network president, in her minimalist Manhattan office overlooking Central Park. "This isn't personal, Mark," she said, her tone measured but final. "We've valued your contributions for 15 years, but the network can't weather this storm. The Sandler comments were the final straw after last month's controversy. We're exercising the morality clause in your contract." Mark felt the floor disappear beneath him. "You're firing me? Over an opinion about Adam Sandler? Over a pattern of increasingly problematic on-air behavior that's costing us viewers and advertisers," Elaine corrected, sliding a folder across her desk. "Your severance details are inside. We'll announce your departure as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities." As Mark left the building that had been his professional home for nearly 2 decades, photographers waited on the sidewalk. The headline was already written: "Winters out in the cold. Host fired after Sandler slam." His carefully constructed world had collapsed in less than a week. The autumn air bit through Mark's coat as he pulled the collar higher, shielding his face while hurrying past the newsstand at the corner of his Upper West Side neighborhood. His own image stared back at him from half a dozen magazine covers, each headline more sensational than the last. "Winters meltdown," "Talk show titan topples," "Sandler's silent victory." Inside his apartment, a spacious penthouse that had once represented achievement but now felt like an expensive prison, Mark ignored the blinking light on his answering machine showing 47 messages. His phone buzzed relentlessly with texts from friends, colleagues, and vultures sensing an opportunity in his downfall. "You've reached a new low," came a familiar voice from behind him. Jessica, his publicist of 12 years, stood in the doorway, having used her emergency key. Her expression conveyed both disappointment and professional calculation. "I didn't hear you come in," Mark said, pouring himself a scotch without offering one to her. Jessica moved deliberately into the living room, placing her tablet on the coffee table. "You weren't answering my calls. I had to make sure you hadn't jumped off your balcony and deprived me of the chance to say I told you so." "Your concern is touching," Mark replied, the ice in his glass clinking softly as he took a seat. "This is salvageable," Jessica said, cutting straight to the point. Her fingers navigated through screens of data. Your Q rating hasn't completely tanked. There's still public interest. Negative attention is still attention. We need a strategy. Mark gazed out at the Manhattan skyline. Maybe I don't want to be salvaged. That's the fatigue talking, Jessica countered, her voice softening slightly. Listen, Mark, this industry chews people up daily. The difference between those who disappear and those who reinvent is simply this: strategic humility. You want me to apologize? Mark's voice hardened. I want you to recognize the reality of your situation, Jessica replied, measuring her words. Your comments about Sandler weren't made in a vacuum. You've been increasingly combative on air for months. The network used this as an opportunity to solve a problem they've been monitoring for some time. The truth of her assessment settled uncomfortably in the room. Have you heard from anyone? Mark asked after a lengthy silence. Diane called. She's concerned. James, too, off the record. And, Jessica hesitated, Adam Sandler's team reached out. Mark's head snapped up. What did they want? To understand the context. They were surprisingly measured. Jessica studied her client carefully. Sandler himself apparently asked them not to pile on, said something about everyone having bad days on camera. This unexpected grace from the very person he'd disparaged cut deeper than any condemnation could have. The following weeks blurred together. Mark declined offers for tell-all interviews and rejected Jessica's suggestion of a carefully orchestrated apology tour. Instead, he retreated to his beach house in the Hamptons, where the off-season emptiness matched his internal landscape. He spent hours walking the deserted beach, replaying not just the Sandler comments but the months leading up to them, the increasing irritability, the growing sense that the cultural conversation had shifted without him, the defensive posturing that had replaced his once genuine curiosity about guests and their perspectives. On a particularly gray Wednesday, Mark was arranging driftwood on the sand when a figure approached from down the beach. Even at a distance, the casual gait was unmistakable. Nice castle you're building there, said Adam Sandler, hands tucked into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, looking exactly like the unpretentious persona he projected on screen. Mark stood, brushing sand from his hands. It's supposed to be a wall. Ah, Sandler nodded, keeping things out or keeping things in. The metaphor wasn't lost on Mark, who found himself unsure how to navigate this improbable encounter. My daughter has a place about a mile down, Sandler explained, gesturing vaguely behind him. I recognized you from the beach. Thought I'd say hi. That's surprisingly civil of you, Mark managed. Sandler shrugged. Figure we've both had enough people talking about us without actually talking to us. They walked along the shoreline, an unlikely pair connected by the strange ecosystem of fame and its consequences. Their conversation, halting at first, gradually found a rhythm that surprised them both. You weren't entirely wrong, Sandler admitted as they sat on a weathered bench overlooking the Atlantic. Some of my films in recent years, I phoned it in. Got comfortable. That doesn't excuse what I said or how I said it, Mark replied, watching a distant sailboat navigate the choppy waters. No, Sandler agreed, but it makes it human. We all lose perspective sometimes. As the unlikely conversation continued, Mark began to see something beyond his immediate crisis, a possible path forward that would require more courage than any public persona he'd ever crafted. The conference room at Creative Artist Agency hummed with a particular energy that only exists when careers hang in the balance. 6 months had passed since Mark's dismissal, and this meeting represented his first tentative step back into the industry. A podcast, said Jessica, who had remarkably stood by him despite the professional risk. Complete creative control. No network oversight. Across the polished table sat Miranda Ochoa, a rising executive who specialized in rehabilitating damaged talent. The media landscape has changed. Traditional gatekeepers matter less. Authenticity matters more. Mark traced the rim of his water glass. And what exactly would I talk about that anyone would want to hear? Miranda leaned forward. The very thing that made you self-destruct. The pressure of maintaining a public persona. The toll of performing opinions rather than developing them. The ecosystem that rewards quick judgment over nuanced understanding. You want me to monetize my breakdown? Mark asked incredulously. I want you to transform it, Miranda countered. You've spent 20 years interviewing others. What if you interviewed yourself with the same scrutiny? What if you explored how the entertainment industry shapes not just content, but the people who create it? The concept resonated in a way Mark hadn't anticipated. Over the following weeks, he worked with a small team to develop Off Script with Mark Winters, a podcast examining the intersection of media, identity, and authenticity. The studio for the inaugural episode was nothing like the glossy set he'd commanded at the network, just a converted spare bedroom in his Hamptons home. Sound-dampening panels installed by an engineer who'd taken a chance on the controversial project. "Welcome to Off Script," Mark began, his voice finding its familiar cadence despite his racing heart. "I'm Mark Winters, and for the first time in my career, I don't have a script. No pre-interviews, no researched questions, no carefully orchestrated segments designed to create the illusion of spontaneity while ensuring we never venture into uncomfortable territory." He continued, his voice growing steadier. 6 months ago, I lost my show after making dismissive, unprofessional comments about Adam Sandler. But that moment wasn't the cause of my downfall. It was the symptom of something that had been building for years. The exhaustion of performing opinions rather than developing them, of becoming a caricature of myself rather than allowing myself to evolve. The podcast launched with modest expectations, but quickly gained traction. Critics praised its unflinching examination of media dynamics, and Mark's willingness to deconstruct his own participation in a system he now questioned. Listeners responded to the raw honesty and the rotation of guests, media critics, former network executives, and even canceled celebrities, who spoke candidly about the construction and destruction of public personas. In the third month, Miranda called with unexpected news. "Adam Sandler's team reached out," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "He's interested in being a guest." The proposition terrified Mark. Their beach conversation had been private, unrecorded, a human moment between two people in extraordinary circumstances. Making it public felt both powerful and potentially exploitative. After days of consideration, Mark called Sandler directly. "Why would you want to do this?" he asked, dispensing with pleasantries. "Same reason I walked up to you on that beach," Sandler replied. "I'm tired of people talking about conversations that never happened. Let's have a real one." The episode recording stretched for nearly 3 hours. They discussed comedy, criticism, career longevity, and the strange symbiosis between entertainers and those who comment on their work. Sandler spoke of moments when criticism had improved his craft and others when it had merely hardened his defenses. Mark explored his own journey from genuine cultural critic to provocateur chasing ratings. "The irony," Mark noted near the end, "is that my comments about you weren't even what I actually believed. They were what I thought would make good television. Controversial enough to get attention, but not so outrageous that I couldn't defend them." "That's the trap, isn't it?" Sandler replied. "When you spend enough time performing reactions, you forget how to have authentic ones." The episode, titled simply Adam, became a cultural touchpoint, not for its controversy, but for its rare demonstration of how public conflicts could transform into meaningful dialogue. The Manhattan afternoon cast long shadows through the high-rise windows of Horizon Media, where network executives had gathered in the walnut-paneled conference room. Jane Walters, the newly appointed head of programming, studied the viewership data projected on the wall with measured interest. "The numbers are compelling," she acknowledged, her finger tracing the upward trajectory of the Off-Script podcast's growth. 15 million downloads last month. The Sandler episode alone reached 23 million. Mark sat across from her, conscious of the power dynamics at play. This room, with its understated luxury and carefully curated art, represented an ecosystem he had once dominated and then been exiled from. Now he was neither supplicant nor conqueror, but something far more interesting, a known quantity with a newly discovered depth. "We're not interested in simply replicating what you're doing in the podcast," Jane continued, sliding a sleek presentation folder across the table. "What interests us is the evolution, both yours and the conversation format itself." Mark left the folder unopened. "I'm not looking to return to traditional television." "Neither are we," Jane countered with a smile that revealed nothing. "At least, not in the way you're thinking." The proposal was unexpected, a limited series of in-depth conversations filmed with minimal production. No studio audience, no musical interludes, no carefully engineered viral moments. Just substantive dialogue with cultural figures who rarely engaged in genuine public discourse. "We're calling it Reconstructed," Jane explained. "Each episode focuses on someone who's experienced a public reckoning and how they've rebuilt, or are rebuilding afterward." Mark considered the concept. "You want me to leverage my own cancellation to create content about others. I want you to use your unique perspective to facilitate conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise," Jane corrected. "You've been on both sides now, the one passing judgment and the one being judged. That creates a space few others can authentically occupy. In the silence that followed, Mark recognized the elegant symmetry of the offer. His professional destruction might actually have created the conditions for work with greater integrity than what had come before. "I'd need complete editorial control," he said finally. Jane nodded. "Within reason. We won't interfere with content. But we do need assurance you're not using this as a platform for settling old scores." "Those scores have already been settled," Mark replied. "Most of them against myself." The spring launch of Reconstructed generated buzz throughout the industry. The set design reinforced the show's concept, a renovated Brooklyn warehouse with exposed brick and steel beams, the architectural elements of Reconstruction visible in the space itself. 2 chairs, positioned neither as adversaries nor as conspirators, but as equals engaged in meaning-making. For the premiere episode, Mark had secured an interview with Catherine Miller, the acclaimed film director who'd retreated from public life after a plagiarism controversy 3 years earlier. "The narrative simplifies as it amplifies," Catherine observed, her hands curved around a ceramic mug as they discussed the mechanics of public judgment. "Nuance requires too much bandwidth, so the story becomes binary. Villain or victim." "And which were you?" Mark asked. "Both. Neither." Catherine's gaze was steady. "I borrowed visual elements without proper attribution. That happened. But the narrative that I was systematically stealing others' creativity throughout my career, that was a construction built on retrospective interpretation of decades of work." The conversation delved into the intricate relationship between creative influence and appropriation, between accountability and proportionality. Unlike his former show, Mark allowed space for complexity, for answers that didn't resolve neatly into sound bites. The series continued with figures from various fields. A tech entrepreneur who'd misrepresented product capabilities, a literary darling who'd fabricated parts of a memoir, a civil rights attorney disbarred for ethical violations. Each conversation explored not just what had happened, but the human experience of standing at the center of a public unraveling. 6 months into the show's run, Mark received a call from Jessica. "The network's thrilled with the numbers," she reported, "and the critics are using words like essential and revolutionary." Mark, walking along the Hudson River as they spoke, watched a container ship navigate the current. "That's not why I'm doing it." "I know," Jessica said, her voice softening. "That's precisely why it's working." The season finale represented Mark's greatest professional risk. After extensive negotiation, he'd secured an agreement to interview Edward Pierce, the network president who had personally signed his termination papers following the Sandler incident. The tension in the room was palpable as cameras prepared to roll. Edward, impeccably dressed as always, sat with the practiced composure of someone accustomed to being on the decision-making side of the table. "This feels circular," Edward noted as a sound technician adjusted his microphone. "Life often is," Mark replied. When the red light illuminated, indicating recording had begun, Mark's approach surprised everyone. "Today's conversation isn't about my firing," he began. "That story has been told. I'm interested instead in the ecosystem that makes such moments inevitable, the intersection of commerce, entertainment, and ethics that creates both careers and casualties." What unfolded was not the confrontation many had anticipated, but rather a surprisingly nuanced exploration of the entertainment industry's structural contradictions. Edward spoke candidly about balancing creative expression against shareholder expectations. Mark acknowledged how the pursuit of ratings had gradually corrupted his original purpose as a cultural commentator. "You weren't dismissed solely because of what you said about Sandler," Edward admitted halfway through. "I know," Mark nodded. "I was dismissed because I'd become a liability rather than an asset." The Sandler comments were simply the clearest justification. "Media isn't designed for redemption arcs," Edward observed. "It's designed for consumption, and sometimes people become the product being consumed." As the conversation concluded, Mark posed the question that had been at the heart of every episode. "What does Reconstruction look like to you?" Edward considered this carefully, acknowledging that systems, not just individuals, need rebuilding, that the metrics we use to measure success might actually be measuring the wrong things entirely. The final scene of the episode showed Mark walking alone through Central Park as autumn leaves scattered across the path. His voiceover delivered the series' conclusion. "Reinvention isn't about reclaiming what was lost. It's about discovering what was previously hidden, even from ourselves. The structures we build, careers, reputations, narratives, are more fragile than we imagine. But perhaps that fragility itself contains a gift, the opportunity to reconstruct with greater awareness of the foundations. 1 year after his very public fall, Mark Winters had found something unexpected in the ruins of his former life. Not just a career rebuilt, but a purpose redefined. The controversy that had seemed like an ending had instead become a doorway to more authentic work, proving that sometimes professional devastation creates the very conditions for personal revelation. Sometimes it takes a public unraveling to discover the threads worth keeping.